Dr. Lawrence, we've been to this press conference and it was rich. We learned so many things. Being an African American, somebody who's been in civil rights for 60 years, you work with Martin Luther King and many other civil rights leaders. Uh, the people who are watching us right now, what can you say to those Africans who aspire for democracy, for human rights, in particular to Rwandan people? This is your opportunity to speak to them.
I am thrilled at the opportunity to address that as an issue. I cannot be more thankful that things happen when they're supposed to happen, not when you want them to happen. And that the people in Rwanda and other parts of Africa have to keep faith. That's a little hard for some because the immediacy is now, but there are things being done. They have to prove to be a little bit more courageous and not run from danger. What we did during the civil rights era, and interesting enough, with all the wars being fought around the world, whether it was in Vietnam or Cambodia or any place else, we were fighting wars here in the streets of America, fighting for the right to be free, challenging the establishment that we have a definite franchised right, not disenfranchised, but franchised right to be treated as Americans. Our entitlements are the same, and they have the same thing in Africa. The major problem for those in Africa centers on tribalism and the acceptance of it. How do you accept the condition or circumstance that puts brother and sister in opposition to each other, mother and father in opposition to each other, when they're of the same bloodline? That's not common sense. There were no advantages financially or otherwise. And if you get dictators who want only their tribal members to hold high positions or positions of authority, they begin to dictate to the others who are not in that particular group. There's a better tomorrow, but they have to believe in themselves and extend yourselves to others who are willing to help. And African Americans are no different than you. You look like every other African American, as I do look like every other African. We're a singular people living in different parts of the world. We have more in common than we have in differences. We have learned much, but you have what we work so hard for. You have other types of opportunities through ownership. Black America in this country, with the 9th largest income if we were a nation on the entire planet Earth, we own absolutely nothing. I'm not talking about the 1/10 of 1% who do own something. We are largely renters, and we deal with the retail aspect of it. We need a reciprocal relationship between African Americans and Africans, and you'll see a marketable change. In other words, you have to build the road where there's an exchange of business and culture, where you strengthen the community. And it's not at the expense of anybody, it's about community stabilization. Here in the United States, it's good for the U.S. and it's good for Africa and any other part of the world. Make yourself become an intricate part of inclusion, as opposed to anyone dictating to any country, whether it's Africa, whether it's in the Middle East or South America, that you are a part of the human experience and you want inclusion. That's an entitlement. That's what human rights are. We fought for civil rights, but we did so poor when it came to economic rights. You have the foundation. You're living in a very rich country, the richest continent on the entire planet Earth. And your poverty is inexcusable. And too much of it is as a result of black thinking negatively with regard to tribalism. I hope I answered that question. I took the long route around. I just want to make sure I was understood.
Yes, you were understood. Yes,
Okay.
it was, so because the struggle that we are encountering right now
Yes.
is a struggle that you've been through. So it's important for us to know as African what you have achieved, how you have achieved it. So if we can emulate or where you have fallen, we can try to correct it. so we can be free. So concerning the reconciliation, like in Rwanda, because I think that was the theme of the young singer. That's what he fought for. What can you say to those young Rwandans who are actually, they are deprived of liberty, deprived of freedom of press, of expressing themselves, and some of them live in terror, that I heard. So what will you recommend to those Rwandans who are, example, who live outside of Rwanda, who live in the United States, but still are afraid for their life and they're living in hidings? What will it be able to
Unification, unifying thought. Separate and independent, you will accomplish little or nothing. Working together towards a common goal makes all of the difference in the world. You can have a huge impact, not just on Rwanda, but you set the standard for other African nations. Out of 55 nations, you fall short of where you could be under given circumstances. I mentioned earlier a very good friend of mine, and his brother just walked into the room. I mentioned a gentleman's name, Charles Taku. Now, Charles Taku is a very unique individual, very brilliant. He did try those war criminals in Rwanda, and it took him 10 years to bring them to the International Court. And he was successful, he and his team. He was a head attorney for the prosecution. Each of those that were charged were found guilty, and each of them got 50 years apiece. Because of their age, we know that they will never get out of prison. They will spend the rest of their lives in prison. The most alarming thing is what's occurring now in this instance, that the absence of education of how that occurred and what avenues or roads they can take to ensure that it doesn't happen again. It goes back again to the electoral process, the election process. Remember, I stated earlier that democracy is inclusive, and capitalism can only work under a democracy. Too many of the 55 African nations do not include the word democracy in their constitutions. If you remember South Africa, South Africa included in their constitution that it was perfectly all right to abuse the privileges of another human being. How wrong could that possibly be correct? Apartheid. It was wrong. They knew it was inherently wrong, but with pressure and working together with your brothers and sisters in this country, in the United States of America, you stand a realistic opportunity to reverse this cause. We're looking at other issues in Cameroon, where they've attempted to destroy the entire fiber of southern Cameroon. I was former consul general to the Federal Republic of Southern Cameroon, and we worked very closely with Paul Biya's regime, not with him in particular, but those who knew that his time was near and what he did was wrong in that instance. Well, the same principles have to apply to Rwanda. And speaking for the people, what you're doing right now is a step in the right direction. Fear not that with which will do you no harm. Remember, the bully carries the fear. The bully wants you to partake in his fear. The bully wants you to run from him out of fear when he hasn't the power or the strength to make that difference. But when you stand up to that bully, just like Goliath did with David, and David stood up to Goliath, one little guy. They didn't think possibly he would have ever beaten this 9-foot, 12-foot giant. But with intelligence, understanding how to use a particular weapon. His was the minor of the weapons, but succeeding with God's will. And I believe the freedoms from Rwandans will come. It'll be reestablished. But your relationships cannot be just with Rwandans themselves. They have to extend themselves outside by reaching out to people like the Takus, Chief Taku, others, Miss Mary in particular. She's a true leader. She won't take credit for it, and I always embarrass her, and rightfully so. but I know the quality of the human being, that she puts people first. Most of the leadership in Africa is not taking the responsibility to put their people first. They put their needs, wants, and desires, and not until that's satisfied. One of the most difficult things for any African leader, someone who becomes a president, they know that once their presidency is up or they're out of the presidency, they leave poor. They have nothing. And if they return back to the community that they came out of to become president, they're not safe, and neither is their family. There has to be programming financially to ensure that their well-being is taken care of as long as they're in leadership on behalf of their people. So democratic principles have to be employed. They should be a priority. And understanding democracy. Democracy is the leadership of the people. Like I mentioned, the American flag, the Rwandan flag. Those are the aspirations of the Rwandan people, to be free, to determine their direction of who they are, what they're going to be, and what their expectations are out of life. Too often we stop out of fear. We oftentimes, through superstition, fear something that doesn't exist. It's only imaginable. Now, I'll give you an example. If you asked a little child, 4-year-old, to draft a monster, you know what he designs as a monster when he draws it? He draws the monster with 2 eyes, 2 arms, hands, 2 legs, mouth with teeth. He's drawing human form. That's the fear you passed on to the child. The child grows up fearing that doesn't exist because somebody fed him superstition. It's good to be cognizant and conscious of where we are today and where we want to take our families and our communities. You can do it by understanding those tools by which you must re-educate and teach the people of the Rwandan community. I learned something very vital about the African community. They love education. I've seen classrooms where they have 200 or 300 people in the classroom, children, wanting to learn how to read or write. We've seen abject poverty, but there are some of the cities in countries in Africa that are absolutely beautiful. But the media doesn't play that. And you'll find similar things in Africa. You see that gentleman sitting in the back of the room, Chinese fellow? It was through him and other associates that a wealthy group in China gave me a $50 billion prime bank guarantee. And we've interfaced and worked with several of the African nations to be able to build some of those roads throughout the interior. Chief Taka was sitting there who can verify that. The biggest objections that I have and the obstacles came from other African Americans and not necessarily the white community. Isn't that interesting?
Very interesting.
A
Thank
pleasure
you
is
so
mine.
much, Dr. Lawrence.
I'll talk and talk as a pastor, you know that.
I know that. I know that when we give opportunity to a Baptist preacher,
Absolutely.
2 minutes become 10 minutes. Yeah. Rwanda has been a country that many Africans has been looking into, because it's true you had a genocide in 1994, but since then Rwanda has done great things economically. Yeah. There's many enterprises. Actually, there's a lot of Rwandans who were in other countries who came back to Rwanda. So economically, it looks like this country is doing very well. Actually, it's a country that makes a lot of Africans proud. However, there is a dark side also, and that dark side is that it seems, because I'm not a Rwandan, that's why I say it seems that a lot of Rwandans do not have the ability to express themselves and to be free to talk about the things that are public, the things that are politics. So being a Rwandan and living in the United States, what can you convey to the youth of your country? What kind of hope can you stress or can you guide them to?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss with you on the situation about my country. as you say, I do agree with you that there is a remarkable progress that has been taking place in Rwanda, and you can imagine where the country has been coming from. It was coming from a genocide, and it's really, the country was highly devastated, and it's like it was really starting from zero, if I can say. So that's why even progress is really, visible. Everyone can see it. However, as you said, there is a dark side that cannot be ignored, because it's like people need economic growth, people need development. That's obvious. I do agree with it. And again, as a Rwandan, I'm so proud when anything good is spoken about the country, what the achievements, everything that has been taking place for the last 25 or 26 years. But the cost of having development minus freedoms is very high. Actually, we can't afford it. It's like there is a kind of narrative as if you have to take either one or the other. You have to take either economic growth or democracy and human rights. But I have always believed in having them both hand in hand. Moving forward, having both economic growth and democracy, actually that's what we strive for. That's why we raise our voice, to make sure that Rwandan people can have economic development, but can also have freedoms. Actually, just to be specific, in 1994, until 1994, there was also a significant development in the country. It's like when you go to, when you read the books that were written by that time, or even these international bodies like World Bank or IMF, you see that time the country was also doing well. Of course, with the genocide, many things have been destroyed. That's why we have to start again. But what does it mean? With economic growth, with development, when you do not have democracy, when you do not respect human rights, you can build and the next day you can destroy. So when we are talking about having both, it's to protect the achievements, is to make sure that what we are achieving can also be backed by the freedoms and the fundamental rights which are actually recognized within our constitution, but not a reality when you go to the real life. So it's like what we are advocating for, what we want to make sure to have, is to say we want both democracy, human rights, and all the other freedoms that we know that human beings deserve. So that's how I can explain it.
Okay, very good. The last question that I would like to ask you is for the Rwandan diaspora, so those Rwandans who are abroad, like in the United States, probably in Europe or elsewhere, those young Rwandans who aspire for democracy and aspire for freedom and more liberties in their country, what kind of advices will you like to convey to them? What kind of message can you give to those Rwandans who are listening probably via YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, what we are doing here today? What kind of encouragement can you give them in order to make democracy, human rights a reality in Rwanda?
Actually, as we are here mainly because of kind of unexpected death or loss of Kizito Mihigo. He was a young man, highly talented, and who have contributed a lot to our country. So because of that, I can say they have a role model, a selfless man who was I can say, doing his best and giving his best. And right now I can say including his life to the purpose in which he believed in, to a purpose which was much bigger than himself. So when it comes to the youth, I can say they really have in Kizito Mihigo a role model for reconciliation, going beyond what he has been going through, his personal story, his personal, background, but thinking about the whole country, thinking about Rwandans who are not just his ethnic group. So I can say the message I can just give to the young people, they should be proud of such a man. They should be proud of working for the country just to have, I can say, another chance of young people who can be the hope for the nation. The young people who can, I can say, who can really show to the dictators, not just in Rwanda, that this is a time for change. This is a time for people to have the freedom. This is a time for people to be united, for people to come together and make sure that they have a voice in their country. So that's the message I can give to the young people, so that the life of Kizito Mihigo may be a strong message, and maybe a time for them to reflect to that rich life, so that they may really draw from it a lesson that can help them to build a strong nation, a nation that recognize freedoms of people, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of speech, any kind of freedom that they really deserve. So that's what I can say to the young people, to strive for freedom.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
This is Frank Jokten. I was really blessed to be in this particular meeting talking about Rwanda, talking about that youth, talking about that young man who did so much for his country. This show me that there is hope for African youth and for the African continent. It is proven now that we are 7 billion people and we will be 11 billion people. It is predicted that the majority of that growth will come from Africa. So that means that Africa is and will remain the youngest continent in the world. That young men and young women, they aspire to great things. Not only they want development in their own country, like in Rwanda, and I'm praising Kagame to make Rwanda the pearl of Africa, or the Switzerland of Africa, but we also want freedom, we also want democracy, and we also want human rights. Because we all this truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal and they are endowed by certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We cannot just provide economic growth to the African youth. We need to provide them with freedom, with liberty, and allow them also to pursue their own happiness. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you so much for listening to us. God bless you, and we will see you another time.